Welcome to the 7th video in this module. In this video, we will define invalidation and explain why it is so important to be an effective validator when doing trauma work. Before we talk about validation, let's first talk about the opposite of that, invalidation. Invalidation is basically whenever some aspect of our experience has been discounted. And there's different ways of invalidating someone. It could be cognitive, for example, well, that's a dumb way to think. It could be emotional, for example, you shouldn't feel that way. It could be behavioral, for example, a slap to the face. And in my opinion, one of the worst forms of invalidation possible is sexual abuse. Because sexual abuse basically sends the message very loud and clear that you do not matter at all. You do not matter physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, sexually. Something that can help us have a better understanding of invalidation is to distinguish between what's sometimes called a big T versus a little t trauma. Big T traumas are obvious and very easy to recognize, whereas little t traumas can be more subtle, not so easy to recognize. Rape would be an obvious example of a big T trauma, but chronic invalidation is sometimes an example of a little t trauma. What we know about little t traumas is that they have a cumulative effect. If we have enough little t traumas, they can be just as harmful as a single big T trauma. In fact, sometimes much more harmful. How do we know that? Well, research has been done on people who have been chronically invalidated, and they develop a very predictable set of symptoms, such as pervasive insecurity, constantly wondering, am I safe? Am I okay? Also, lack of internal veracity or credibility, self-doubt. Can I even believe my own experience? They also tend to experience intrusive thoughts or memories of the invalidation. They might even re-experience the invalidation. They might experience intense shame, confusion, anger, defensiveness. They might have increased sensitivity to invalidation or increased efforts to elicit validation. In other words, avoid invalidation, or invalidators, they might also develop an intense distrust in other people. And it might even border on a pseudo-paranoia. As I was listing those different symptoms, did you notice that that strongly resembles PTSD? Especially symptoms of avoidance, of re-experiencing, or the symptoms of having intrusions. That's the stuff of PTSD. Chronic invalidation is traumatizing. In fact, we can look at it both ways. Trauma is invalidating, and invalidation is traumatizing. That is precisely why validation is such an important skill in DBT. And validation is essential whenever we're doing trauma work. It's essential for any kind of effective psychotherapy in general. DBT has 6 different levels of validation. These different levels are like a pyramid in that the higher levels build on the prior levels. But they are not a hierarchy in the sense that the higher levels are somehow better than the lower levels. Different clients in different situations will require different levels of validation. And it's up to the therapist to determine the appropriate form of validation. The first level of validation is to be present and mindful. That might sound very obvious, but just because it's obvious doesn't mean it's always easy. There are sometimes 3 different clients who are actively in crisis, but I'm only in session with one of them. And it can be very difficult to be mindful in the moment with that one client when I know I also have other clients in crisis. Or especially now that we have all become accustomed to doing telehealth, there are times I'm with a client on my screen and I can't help but notice all of these messages that are flooding my inbox and bombarding me. It's not always so easy to be present and mindful in a session with a client. The second level of validation is when we reflect back the verbal communication. That's when we paraphrase, summarize what they're saying, ask clarifying questions, basically show that we are tracking with what they are saying. The third level of validation is when we reflect back nonverbal communication. This is when we demonstrate attunement to our client by using basic mirroring techniques. If a client starts to speak more quickly, that's our cue to also accelerate our rate of speech. Or if a client starts to speak more softly, that's our cue to also decrease our volume. Or if our client just subtly moves forward in their seat, that's our cue to do the same. This is an extremely powerful process because at a deeply subconscious level, the client is realizing that we are tracking with them and they feel that chemistry, that connection. There's a big difference between mirror versus mimic. We're not mimicking our clients, we are mirroring them. Just to demonstrate how powerful this is, I want to briefly quote a research study here. So in a 2007 study on corporate business negotiations, Columbia University psychologist Adam Galinsky and his colleagues asked one group of participants to mirror their partner's behavior and the others to go in cold. The result was shocking. Out of 15 negotiations in which people mirrored their opponents, 10 ended in deals, while only 2 of the 16 negotiations without mirroring were able to close the deal. The 4th and 5th levels of validation are closely related. 4th level is when we normalize the client's historical context behind what they're saying. The 5th level is when we normalize the present context. A lot of times you can do both at the same time. One great phrase to use is, it makes sense that. For example, you've had lots of wacky boyfriends in the past, so it makes sense that you are reluctant to go on another dating relationship right now. In that simple statement, I normalized the historical background. You've had lots of difficult dating relationships in the past. Therefore, it makes sense that you might be reluctant to dive into a new relationship right now. I normalized the past, also normalized the present. And the 6th and final level of validation is when we demonstrate what DBT calls radical genuineness. Radical genuineness is when we are real with someone, basically the same way we would be real with someone in a non-clinical relationship. That's the ultimate way to reflect back their reality. In other words, to validate. Radical genuineness requires strong clinical rapport. It requires a robust therapeutic alliance. We can't just be brutally real with our clients. But that's why it's the highest level of validation, because it requires all of the previous levels. Don't bother trying to be radically genuine with a client if you're not first doing levels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You better be present and mindful, be reflecting back both verbal and nonverbal communication. You better be doing a good job of normalizing historical and present circumstances. Once you already have strong therapeutic alliance with the client because you're doing all of this validating, and then you use radical genuineness, now you can have an even stronger therapeutic alliance because the client will see you as real and therefore trust you even more. There are 4 ways we can be radically genuine with our clients. These are all ways you would be real with a real person outside of the therapeutic relationship. I'm not trying to imply that your client is your friend. My point is there are certain ways we are real in relationships that have nothing to do with psychotherapy. One way is through cheerleading. Let me use the example of a friend. Sometimes what your friend needs is a little pep talk. Come on, you've got this. I know you can do this. I've seen you do this before. You're going to rock this. Another way we can be real with a friend is through appropriate self-disclosure. Something you might tell your friend is, oh my goodness, yes, I do know what it's like to lose a job. That was one of the worst times of my life. I just had so much anxiety when that happened. That's some self-disclosure. Another way to be real with someone is what DBT calls clinical irreverence. This is basically when we speak truth to a client that they need to hear, but not quite in the way that they were expecting. It has some shock value, but ideally some humor. The whole point of irreverence is to help the client become more dialectical, to see the situation that they're in from a different perspective. Let me give you an example of this. I used to work with adolescents in a residential treatment facility. Once I had a client in residential placement tell me, I think I'm going to run away. I simply asked him, well, have you thought through your escape plan yet? He said no. I told him, well, great, then let's use this session to plan your escape. And we did. That was the last thing he was expecting me to say. But by the end of the session, he realized that the escape plan was too complicated and that it would just be much easier for him to simply complete the program. That was an example of irreverence because I spoke truth to him that I needed to hear, but not in the way he was expecting. And it even had some shock value, but also some humor. And it helped him become more dialectical, think through the situation from a different perspective. Another way we can be real with our clients is through functional validation. Sometimes, instead of providing verbal validation, the most effective validation is actually helping a client solve the problem. For example, if I am walking down a flight of stairs and I stumble and spill my books everywhere, you could walk up to me and say, wow, that looks embarrassing. You would certainly be reflecting back my experience, but actually what would be much more validating is if you helped me pick up the pile of books. That's functional validation. Helping someone with the problem is sometimes much more validating than verbally reflecting back their experience. So how does that relate to the clinical context? Well, let's assume you have a client that comes into a session and they tell you, oh my goodness, I am so anxious. My anxiety is through the roof because I cannot pay my rent this month on time. I don't know what I'm going to tell my landlord. Well, you could verbally validate that, like, oh, that sounds terrible. Or what you could do is say, you know what? Let's take 5 minutes right now and let's call your landlord because we've been working on interpersonal effectiveness skills anyway, and this would be a perfect opportunity to try out some assertiveness. So how about you call your landlord? I'll be right here to coach you through the conversation. I'll be here to support you through this. That's an example of functional validation. Therapists must use clinical judgment to determine the appropriate form of validation. We don't spend every single session giving pep talks or self-disclosing or making snarky comments or calling landlords. Obviously, there's more psychotherapy than that. However, radical genuineness can be a powerful form of validation when clinically indicated. So we do these different forms of radical genuineness when that's going to be a strong way to validate and a very effective way of fostering the therapeutic alliance even more. So let's just summarize with a few key points. So first of all, trauma is invalidating and invalidation is traumatizing. People who have been chronically invalidated can experience the same basic PTSD symptoms as someone who is more overtly traumatized. Put another way, chronic little t traumas, such as ongoing invalidation, have a cumulative effect which results in the same harmful consequences as big T traumas. Therefore, validation is essential for all trauma work. Second point, effective validation involves the following components: being present and mindful, reflecting back both verbal and nonverbal communication, normalizing both past and present experiences, and radical genuineness. A DBT therapist is always validating, but does not use all the forms of validation all the time. Which form of validation to use and when requires clinical judgment. And the third point, radical genuineness is the highest form of validation and requires all other forms of validation to be in place. Radical genuineness is when you are openly authentic with a client. Radical genuineness may involve cheerleading, self-disclosure, irreverence, or functional validation, actually helping someone with an issue as opposed to verbal validation alone.